Evening, friend. You ever had that feeling? That eerie, bone-deep kind of feeling? Like the world just ain't sitting right? Like you turned a corner and, for just a second, things felt off. Maybe it's the way the air shifts, or how a place looks just a little too old for its time. Or maybe, just maybe, you stepped somewhere you weren't supposed to. Into a crack between the past and the present. What if time don't move the way we think it does? Most folks figure time's like an arrow, flying straight from yesterday into tomorrow. But what if it ain't? What if time loops, bends, even folds over itself, letting some poor soul wander right out of their own place in history and into someone else's? Tonight, I got 3 stories for you. 3 real-life cases of people who claim they slipped into another time and lived to tell about it. Some say they saw the past, others, the future. And science, well, science don't have all the answers. So settle in, get comfortable, and by the end of this tale, you might just wonder if it could happen to you. You ever put something down, turned your back, and when you looked again it was gone? You ever walked into a place that felt old? Not in the way of age, but in the way that it didn't quite belong? If you have, you're not alone. Tonight, we ain't just telling ghost stories. We're asking the question that might just change the way you see the world. What if time isn't what we think it is? They tell us time moves forward, neat and tidy, from past to present to future. But what if it don't? What if time loops back on itself, tangles, folds over? What if every now and then it lets someone through? Well, folks, settle in, 'cause tonight we got 3 stories. 3 real-life accounts of people who claim they slipped into another time and back again. And by the end, you might just wonder if it could happen to you. Chapter 1. Alice and the Lost Street of 1946. Alice wasn't the type to believe in tall tales or ghost stories. She was practical. Worked in a library, loved her books, and kept her feet planted firmly in the world of reason. But reason had no place in what happened that day. She was running late, weaving through the crowds of Bold Street in Liverpool. The year was 1996, the afternoon young, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. She checked her watch, 2:45 p.m., and hurried toward her favorite bookstore. And then, everything changed. The air turned thick, heavy, like she was wading through something unseen. The city sounds faded. No honking cars, no chatter, just a low, humming vibration in her ears. Then came the stillness. That kind of stillness that don't belong in a busy street. Alice stopped, blinked. And in that blink, the world around her was gone. The modern storefronts vanished. Neon lights, now old-fashioned painted signs. The pavement beneath her feet had changed too. She turned slowly, taking it all in. The people, their 1940s-style clothes, the scent of coal smoke and fresh bread on the air. She reached for her cell phone, fingers fumbling. No signal, no power. A woman stepped out of a shop, carrying a paper-wrapped package. Her dress floral, her curls pinned just so. Alice's heart hammered in her chest. "Excuse me," Alice asked, voice tight. What year is this?" The woman gave her an odd look. "Why, it's the 5th of October, 1946, miss." Alice's stomach dropped. This wasn't possible. The world around her started to bend, blur. like a dream unraveling. And then she was back. The noise of the modern world slammed into her ears. Cars, voices, neon signs flashing. Her phone lit up in her hand, like nothing ever happened. Alice stood frozen, gasping for breath, her mind racing. Had she imagined it? A hallucination? Or had she just taken a step outside of time? Alice didn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop thinking about it. The smell of coal smoke, the way the people walked, talking just a little too proper, a little too slow. The way the sky seemed heavier, the light filtered just a little dimmer. She wasn't crazy. She knew what she saw. So she did what any librarian would do. She researched, and what she found, it made her blood run cold. Alice wasn't the only one to see a different time on Bold Street. There were others. A retired policeman who swore he walked the same street and found horse-drawn carriages where cars should be. A teenager who walked past a shop that hadn't existed for 60 years. A woman who bought a purse from a store, only to find out that store had been torn down before she was even born. Alice had to know. She couldn't leave it alone. Every weekend, she walked back down Bold Street, retracing her steps, hoping to feel that shift in the air again. Sometimes she thought she could almost hear it, that low hum, like an old radio between stations. Sometimes she'd stand there, in the exact spot where she had crossed over, eyes shut tight, breath held, willing herself to slip back through. But it never happened. Weeks passed, then months. She kept looking, kept searching for answers. And then she found one. Tucked away in an old newspaper archive, Alice came across a strange little article from 1946. A woman had been found, wandering Bold Street in a daze, claiming she had come from the future. Alice's hands shook as she read. The description of the woman. It was eerily close to her own. The woman had vanished shortly after. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a mystery, lost to time. So, what's going on here? Was it a crack in time? Was it a hallucination? A trick of the brain? Or was Alice somehow remembering something that never happened? Some scientists believe places with strong electromagnetic fields can trigger hallucinations, distort memory, even mess with time itself. Others say history leaves an imprint, and under the right conditions, some folks might be able to, well, step inside it. And then there are those who believe time ain't fixed at all, that it loops, folds over itself, and every now and then, lets someone slip through the cracks. Well, folks, if that story doesn't make the hairs on your arms stand up, the next one just might. Chapter 2. The Hotel That Never Was. Now, this next tale takes us back to 1979. A British couple, Jeff and Pauline, were taking a road trip through France. They had been driving for hours, long stretches of empty road rolling past them, the trees casting long shadows under the dusky sky. It was late, too late to keep pushing on, and they were desperate to find a place to rest. That's when they saw it. A little hotel, tucked just off the main road, barely visible through the trees. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the kind of craftsmanship that don't belong to modern times. The windows glowed warm with candlelight, flickering soft against the old stone walls. No neon signs, no buzzing fluorescents, Just the quiet hum of a place lost in time. It was perfect. Cozy, unassuming. A place that felt like home the second they stepped inside. The innkeeper, an older man with a kind but distant gaze, greeted them with a simple nod. He spoke in French, slow and deliberate, like he wasn't used to visitors. The other guests, they were quiet. Their clothes old-fashioned. Not in a retro, trendy kind of way. More like they'd been pulled straight from another century. Jeff and Pauline didn't think much of it at first. Traveling through small towns, you meet all kinds of folks. But something felt off. The dinner they were served was hearty but unusual. A thick, rich stew, paired with rustic bread, warm and fresh out the oven. But it lacked the spices and complexity they were used to. No salt, no pepper. Just simple, old-world cooking. The wine? Unfamiliar. No label, no bottle. Just poured straight from a clay pitcher. The room was simple. Wooden beams overhead, no electricity, no modern fixtures. They lit their way with oil lamps. The bed was heavy, carved oak. The sheets coarse like they'd been hand-woven. There were no locks on the doors, just a simple latch. And yet, they slept soundly, too soundly. When they woke, the first thing they noticed was the light. It was hazy, golden, like they were waking up in the middle of a dream. The air felt heavy, charged, like the stillness right before a thunderstorm. Outside, the street was eerily quiet. No birds, no morning traffic. Just stillness. They gathered their things, headed down to the lobby. The innkeeper was already there, waiting. No pleasantries, just a small, expectant nod. When Jeff pulled out his wallet to pay, the man shook his head, gesturing for cash only. Odd, but not unheard of. Jeff pulled out some modern French francs, but the old man's brows knit together. He inspected the bills like he'd never seen them before. Finally, he hesitated and accepted them. Handed them back a handwritten receipt. Pauline glanced back as they left. The other guests, the ones they'd barely seen the night before, stood in the doorway, watching. Not waving, not smiling, just watching. As they pulled onto the road, Pauline looked back one last time, and the hotel was gone. Years later, Jeff and Pauline were back in France, driving that same road. They had talked about that night 100 times. Something about it stuck with them, nagged at the back of their minds. This time, they had a plan. They'd find that hotel again. Relive the nostalgia. Prove to themselves it was real. But the road was empty. They drove for miles, turned down every side path, searched every possible place. No hotel, no ruins, nothing. They stopped at a local cafe, asking around about an old inn that might have been there. The locals just shook their heads. None. There's never been a hotel on that road. Jeff pulled out the receipt the innkeeper had given them. The only proof they had that night was real. Except the paper was blank, like the ink had just faded from existence. So where had Jeff and Pauline stayed that night? Some folks believe they spent the night in a place that had long since disappeared. A building from another time, sitting just long enough to catch two unsuspecting travelers. Others say they stepped through a fold in time, stayed the night in a world that no longer existed, and barely made it back before it vanished again. And some? Well, they believe the couple were meant to stay there forever, but something let them go. We may never know the truth, But if you ever find yourself driving late at night on an unfamiliar road and you see a warm, inviting light off in the distance, be careful where you stop. Some doors ain't meant to be opened. Chapter 3. The Man Who Vanished into the Future. Ever heard of Rudolph Fentz? Legend says, one summer night in 1950, a man appeared out of nowhere in Times Square. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a top hat and coat from the 1800s, looking around like he'd been dropped in the middle of a foreign world. His expression? Lost, confused, afraid. Witnesses say he stood in the middle of the sidewalk, turning in circles, his eyes flicking between the neon signs, the blaring horns of taxis, the sheer height of the buildings that loomed over him, like a man who had just stepped into another time. Then he ran, straight into the street, and into the path of an oncoming taxi. Died on impact. That should have been the end of it. A tragic accident, an unremarkable footnote in the endless churn of the city. Except when they searched his pockets. That's when things got strange. At first, the cops figured him for some old-timer who had fallen on hard luck. Maybe he had dementia. Maybe he was a drifter. But his clothes weren't just old-fashioned. They were pristine, made of fabrics and stitches that hadn't been used in decades. Then came the pocket watch, intricate, engraved, like something out of a museum. Then the coins, outdated currency that hadn't been in circulation for over 100 years. Then the business card. It read, Rudolph Fentz, 5th Avenue Business Services. The company didn't exist. Not in 1950 anyway. But when investigators dug deep into old records, they found a Rudolph Fentz, reported missing in 1876. Same name, same description, vanished without a trace. They went through the archives, dusting off old records, digging through newspaper clippings. Turns out, in June of 1876, a man named Rudolph Fentz had gone out for an evening walk. He was last seen strolling near his home in New York City. He never came back. His family searched for him, posted flyers, contacted the authorities, waited. But no body was ever found. No trace, no evidence. He had just disappeared. Until 74 years later, when he showed up in Times Square out of nowhere and was hit by a taxi. Same height. Same building. Same age as he had been in 1876. It was as if he had stepped forward in time, like no time had passed at all. Now, here's where things get real strange. Some say Rudolph Fentz was a time traveler, a man who slipped through a crack in time, unknowingly jumping nearly a century ahead. Others believe he was caught in what scientists call a time slip, where past and future collide, letting a person fall right through. And then there are those who think it's all just a well-crafted urban legend, a spooky tale passed down over the years, twisted and reshaped like a ghost story. But here's the thing. If it's just a myth, why do so many cases just like it exist? Why do people report vanishings that don't make sense? Why do some folks swear they've seen people out of place and out of time? And why, every now and then, do we hear about people who appear lost, disoriented, terrified, claiming they don't belong in the world they woke up in? Maybe Rudolph Fentz was just one case. Or maybe he was proof. Scientists, skeptics, and storytellers alike have been trying to make sense of cases like this for decades. Here are some of the leading theories: quantum entanglement and time loops. Some believe that time don't move like an arrow. It bends, folds, and twists. Maybe, just maybe, some folks fall through the cracks. Multiverse theory. What if we're living in layers of reality, stacked like pages of a book? Sometimes those pages touch, and people slip between them. Electromagnetic anomalies, places with high electromagnetic activity, like the Bermuda Triangle or certain fault lines, are thought to cause distortions in time and space. Could Rudolph have stepped through one? Residual energy imprints. Some say time don't disappear, it lingers, like a record playing a loop over and over, and every now and then, someone steps right into it. So folks, what do you think? Was Rudolph Fentz just a tragic mystery? A man lost in the shuffle of history? Or was he something more? I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where time didn't feel quite right? A place, a person, an experience that made you think maybe, just maybe, you weren't where or when you were supposed to be? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. And who knows, maybe your story will be next. And if you love tales like these, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell, and join us again for another journey into the unknown. Until next time, keep your eyes open, 'cause sometimes time don't move the way we think it does.